Okay, guys, so we'll make a start. So thank you for attending today. As I say, today's webinar in the Let's Talk series is around about disaster recovery. So I hopefully won't be teaching my mother how to suck eggs here, but we'll talk a little bit about what is disaster recovery. Understanding the difference between disaster recovery and the wider spectrum of uh, um, fault tolerance and business continuity that organizations might want to put in place. Understanding disaster recovery versus backup. Believe it or not, there are some organizations who still believe that a backup is a form of disaster recovery, and whilst in some cases you might say it is, really these are two distinct systems, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Understanding the typical disaster recovery challenges, not only from a technical aspect, but also from a business process aspect. Talking a little bit, obviously, about what Nova School can do for organizations with our disaster recovery as a service solution. And time permitting, and we're trying to keep this to around about a 30-minute webinar, but time permitting, chance for Q&A. If you do have any questions as we go along, just either raise your hand or send a question through the question pane on your right-hand side. So let's start off. So business continuity is the wider idea of making sure that in the event of something going wrong, your business continues to work. So you're open for business as usual, people can still ring you, web chat with you, whatever tool you use. It might be that your business continuity isn't so much about something affecting your systems or data center, but something possibly affecting staff's ability to get to the normal place of work. So, business continuity quite validly includes things like remote working, off-site working, non-standard office working locations, that sort of thing. And also, it does include recovery. And recovery might be recovery of files following some sort of ransomware attack, as we've seen recently inside the NHS. It might be recovery of systems following a corruption of an application or a database or something like that. And it's basically just making sure that even if you've had to move locations, your users, your customers, your clients can still get in touch with your business. On a wider scale, disaster recovery is about actually recovering individual services. And those services might be your Windows servers, they might be your security authentication services, your Exchange, your SQL server, anything like that, yeah? And we've noted in there that sometimes when you recover, you actually end up in a different geographical location than you were initially placed in. So you might want to think about tool sets that use things like EasyDNS, so that if you failed over to a secondary IP address in a secondary data center, all that works for you. DR in itself does not equal backup, and vice versa. Backup does not equal DR. Backup is really about taking a copy of your data, and I ran a ransomware webinar a few weeks ago, funnily enough the week before the WannaCry attack, so that wasn't a prediction or anything, but it's about backing up your data to protect the integrity and granular level of the data, whether that data be a database itself, whether it be a file system, whether it be the contents of a website. Disaster recovery is more about preparing to recover full systems or services in the event that the primary location offering those systems or services is compromised in some way. So both have a solution to offer, both are valid parts of business continuity. I suppose in most cases, the fact of whether you're enacting DR or enacting a recovery from backup really depends on the scale of the problem that you're hit with. So if we look at DR and backup as a comparison, yeah, DR and backup both have a push button, yeah? But the push button is, what are you trying to achieve when you push that button? In a backup, you're trying to manually restore from a successful backup set a subset of your data. Whereas in a DR, you're trying to recover a whole service or a whole system, yeah? So you're failing over from maybe one set of compute resources in one location to another set of compute resources in another location. Backup needs a process. You back up your data every night, and the people who do the backup are trained to do restores. So when someone calls for a restore, all they're basically saying to you is, I want this file set, this directory, this file, this database restored from last night's backup. DR actually needs more of a blueprint, because you need to understand more than just bring the systems up somewhere else. How are the users going to get to the system? How are the public going to get to the web services that you may be hosting on that system? How are you going to manage that whole process? And bearing in mind the amount of time it may take to bring that whole system up, and in some cases the disruption that there may be to service in doing that, is the event that's causing you to consider a DR failover going to last long enough to make the process of enacting DR worth it? Yeah. So if it's a problem because of an outage on an internet link in a data center, your internet provider might say to you, well, the plan is it will be back up in 2 hours. Would you enact DR? If, however, as recently happened about a year and a half ago in Belfast, it's that there's a fire in the data center, and these things do happen, then more keenly you might be saying, actually, there's a fire. It's going to be a while before the data center's back up. We need to enact the DR. In terms of what you actually get, backup is something that most organizations might do nightly. You may even do it more frequently. So when you're restoring something from backup, yes, you're restoring a small subset or a subset of your data, but there's multiple recovery points you can choose from. Do I want to restore it as it was backed up last night, or maybe the night before, or maybe last week or last month? It might be that what you're trying to restore is an archived piece of data that's been deleted off the system at a year end, and now someone's asking for it back. Whereas DR is generically a failover to a single point in time instance. Yeah. So when you're enacting DR, your DR system basically has a known good point of recovery, what we call your recovery point objective. And generally, most DR systems only hold the most recent recovery point objective, or maybe it and the one before. They're not going to hold months or years back, because that would just be too cumbersome in terms of storage and facilities required. And then finally, how long is it going to take? So this is where we come across something called the recovery time objective. So the recovery time objective for DR is something that you can measure through your DR testing. How long does it take to boot up the systems? How long does it then take to make the systems accessible? How long does it then take to make the systems maybe publicly accessible through the internet for customers? So that's something you can have time on. Whereas with backup, the recovery really is completely determined on how much you're trying to recover. If someone's simply trying to recover one file from last night's backup, that could be a matter of minutes or maybe even seconds, depending on what toolset you're using. If someone's trying to recover terabytes or gigabytes of data from the backup, then obviously the process of kicking off the recovery is quite quick. But actually the time it takes to get the data back, it all depends on where you're reading it from, where you're writing it to, how busy the system is, how much data, those sort of things. So there's a very wide difference there between the two solutions. So unfortunately, I still come across this. Our disaster recovery plan goes something like this, and someone's in the corner screaming help. And thank you very much to Scott Adams and his cartoon feature called Dilbert, which I've plagiarized there. But basically, when you sit down and think about DR, DR actually has more nuances to it than just having a DR data center and a replica of your data out there. Some of the things you might want to think about is, well, have I got any DR choices at the minute? Have I even got budget or time or effort, or is it a big enough risk to the business for them to spend money on doing this? Is there anything I can do within the existing systems to avoid the disaster? So it might be that you've historically had servers sitting on your site as physical hardware, and you might say, well, one of the steps towards disaster avoidance is to virtualize, and now the server becomes an entity that can run on any piece of hardware that's running your virtualization platform, and you can take advantage of if one of your VMware, Hyper-V, Xen server hosts go down, you can simply bring up the VM on another one of the hosts. You may also consider building your own DR solution, yeah? So you might invest in 2 locations and interconnectivity between them and some sort of SAN level or software level replication tool that replicates from one location to the other, allowing you to fail over. And the final one, which is becoming more and more prevalent in the marketplace, is you might invest in a DR as a service. And of course, today I'm going to be outlining the Novasco DR as a service, but as I say, other DR as a service solutions do exist. Ours just happens to be really, really good. So, disaster avoidance. So we sort of quickly talked about this. This might be the separation of your company offices and supporting IT infrastructure. You might make a choice to move your infrastructure to a less risky location. That might be a tier 3 data center, for example, using some colo. Or you may even architect an active infrastructure across both locations. So time and time again, we're seeing organizations having Exchange Server A in location 1 and Exchange Server B in location 2. And if A needs to come down, and not only for disaster, but for patching or for maintenance or for upgrades, without the users knowing it, they're automatically failed over to the second location to be. And the only difference they might see is a slight performance differentiation because they're now going over another WAN link to a different location. DR itself brings business challenges. The first thing I will say is that it's not just a tick box. Yeah, across our industry, there seems to be a rosy fail, maybe inside management of organizations, but outside of IT, that DR, yes, we've got DR. There's also sometimes misconceptions. You might have a DR process for a line of business application like your CRM or your finance package, because somewhere in some meeting someone's mentioned that there is a 30-minute recovery time objective and a 4-hour recovery point objective for that one line of business app, suddenly everybody's under the misconception that that covers all line of business applications. DR costs money, let's be honest with you. It's like an insurance plan. You're basically saying, this shouldn't happen, but if it does, I've got a way of dealing with it. And we should always think about that. When I was talking about ransomware a couple of weeks ago, the focus there was on there are 2 types of organization, those that have been hit by ransomware and those that will. And you need that mindset. Now, what you then have to do is convey that mindset into the business owners, the business drivers, the financial controllers to basically say, this money is worth spending. These are the benefits we're going to get out of it. And sometimes if you're planning a DR that includes disaster avoidance, you can also show back to the business, right, here's DR, it includes disaster avoidance. We've split our Exchange server, our line of business application across the 2 sites. So if a site goes down, we're covered. Everything continues working. And the other benefit, and the real benefit to the business, is that when we need to patch, we no longer have to take that line of business application out of circulation for the users. As I referred to a little bit along, be very careful about how you set the expectations here. Make sure that you have a defined internal service level agreement so that people understand what is covered by the DR process, what the recovery point objective is for individual application layers with inside the DR, what the recovery time objective is. And when you talk about those features, make sure that people understand you're talking about the technical recovery point. I am replicating every 4 hours, so my recovery point is anywhere between 1 minute, if you fail at 1 minute after your last replication, or 3 hours, 59 minutes. Yeah? But that's just to get the system back up. The true recovery time objective to the business is making the decision to fail over, enacting the failover, and then, in all honesty, recovering from the 4 hours, 4.5 hours, whatever it was, of missing access to that application. Your business may have failed into doing things on paper, and people now have to start to rekey data back into the system. So whilst the system is up and operational within 4 hours, it might take the business a day or maybe even longer to get back to operation as normal. As I say, a lot of people outside IT have a very rosy view of how DR works, and let's be warning here, there are unicorns involved in all of these. And Thomas Edison, I think, is quoted as saying, a vision without the ability to execute is no different than an hallucination. It's a favorite quote of mine when we come to talk about things like this. But people need to understand that you need to have a tried and tested process. And that process will not just involve technical items, but also business processes. Who makes the decision to fail over to DR? Because as I said earlier on, it might be that someone says, oh, we can fail to DR, and then someone rightly comes in and says, yes, but the ISP, the line provider, the data center provider, whoever has told me that, will be back up and operational within an hour. So if it's going to take me 2 hours to fail over, and when I fail over, I'm going to lose maybe a maximum of 4 hours of work, is it maybe better to say I will leave it and just wait until the problem is resolved? And then maybe if they come back and say, actually, the problem's going to take longer, you can then make your decision to fail over to DR. Building your own DR, it's doable. It has its challenges. First of all, you have to identify, have I got 2 locations I can use? Have they got enough power, enough cooling, enough connectivity? How am I going to replicate the data? How am I going to manage? How am I going to deal with making sure that when I fail over to the environment, do I have a specific order to understand of how machines come up? How are machines interrelated? So, sometimes it's not just the order that you bring them up, but the point that you recover them to. The worst thing you could do in the world is recover one database, which is your stock level, which is 24 hours out of date, and another database, which is your sales ledger, which is only 4 hours out of date. As a result, you end up with a mismatch of data. So it's all these sort of processes need to be thought about. And that's why in recent years, people have looked to use organizations like ourselves who provide a DR as a service, because we can hold you through that process, help you identify everything, and do everything for you. So build your own DR, the value challenge, yeah? Sometimes without an actual DR event, how can you represent the value to the business? Yeah, it's like an insurance policy. Now, as I said earlier on, if you're building a DR system that includes disaster avoidance, you can maybe think about showing normal business processes that are either removed or reduced risk to the business because you've got that disaster avoidance or that DR. I've worked with some organizations who have the ability to bring up their DR environment in an isolated way without affecting the DR process itself, and then test software upgrades in there, test patches in there, and so forth. Higher system utilization is better for your value. However, higher system utilization is worse risk for growth. Yeah. So here we're talking about, if you expand the production system, remember that a year ago you built DR, and you've got to make sure that the DR can now work with the expanded production. One of the things is the value trap. The other thing that is sometimes misconceived is that I've got a line of business application and I've got a DR to a second location, and the business sits there and goes, right, we're covered. However, you have to be sure that you are 100% honest with them. Yes, but when we fail over to DR, because we've used older equipment, so we've refreshed our production system and moved the old production system to DR, so it may not perform in the same way. It may have a higher risk associated with it because it's got hardware maintenance issues, it's older kit. Or it may be that in order to afford the DR, you went for lower spec. So you might only have 50% capacity or even 50% performance. And the most typical example we see of that is people going for high performance SSD or SAS disks in the primary location, and then lower end SATA systems in the secondary location. And this becomes a problem because the SAS systems on average will perform twice, if not 2.5 times faster than SATA, but on average they are 50% of the capacity. So if I've got 10 terabytes in production, and to do that I've used 100 1 terabyte SAS disks, and then in SATA I've actually gone for 10 terabytes, 100 gigabyte SSDs, and in SATA what I've actually gone for is 5 2 TB drives? Well, first of all, there's a performance difference between the SSD and the SATA. And the second thing there is that you also have this issue of you've reduced the number of spindles. So not only are the spindles slower, but they are actually reduced in quantity. I'm just seeing someone's put their hand up. I'm not sure if that's an old hand up, but yeah, if you have got a question, please use the question pane and I'll try and answer. So failover considerations, the first thing is recovery points. Unless you've designed it this way, unless you've somehow integrated your application to be aware that at midnight and 4 AM and 8 AM and noon I'm doing a DR recover or replication to a second site, make sure that you understand that the application may be in what we call a crash consistent state. Now, a lot of applications, Active Directory, things like Exchange, even SQL with its logs, can sometimes cover from crash consistent. By crash consistent, we mean it will be just like someone went in, pulled the power out of the machine, and then put it back in. Now, in a database environment, that means it was halfway through a database transaction. It's updated tables A, B, and C, rows 1, 2, and 3, but it hasn't got to tables D, E, and F yet. And as a result, when you come back up, you're halfway through. You can use logging to help with that, but you need to be careful of that. As I've said time and time again in this session, deciding to fail over is a business decision, not a technical decision. We are simply the enablers, and you have to make that decision. For example, with ourselves, we won't just take someone's word for that they've made that decision. We want something as a written approval. We want to know who the business owner, business manager is that can make that process. They'll be on a VIP list with us, and they're the ones that have to call the shots. We will happily attend and talk to you during that process. We had a client in Northern Ireland recently who needed to enact DR, and basically they called, for want of a better, a DR war panel, and we sat in that war panel and told them, right, if you're going to do this, this is how long it's going to take, this is what you're going to have to do, here's your run book, here's how we're going to do it, and it's going to take 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours. So what's the feedback from the thing that's gone wrong? Will it be fixed in 2 hours? Will it be fixed in 3 hours? Will it be fixed in 4 hours? Another thing to consider is licensing. If you're enacting DR, and specifically if you're going to a DR as a service like ours, you're moving off one piece of tin that you own and you've maybe licensed by buying licenses to it, to a, in most cases, shared platform. And Microsoft won't let you migrate licenses to a shared platform. On their shared platforms, when you've got cloud providers like ourselves, they insist on something called service provider licensing, which basically means you pay a charge per month for each application Microsoft that you have running. So when you fail over to DR, whether you're in it for an hour, a day, a week, or the full month, the cost of extra Microsoft licensing is going to be the same. And the only time that's going to get bigger is when you trip into the second month. You also need to consider, right, I've done this DR because something went wrong. Now, if that something that went wrong was your building went on fire and burnt to the ground, then you may never be thinking about failing back. You might simply be thinking about building something new and migrating into it. It's still a form of failback. So think about how you fail back. Think about the work that needs to be involved to make sure you fail back. And also think, it's very pessimistic of me to say this, but also think, it's happened once, what's going to happen or stop it happening again? So if I'm in DR, how quickly do I need to get something else up and running somewhere else to provide, for want of a better term, DR for my DR? Because things can go wrong. Now, in our case, we fail you over into a DR system that's well maintained, it sits in a tier 3 or above data center, and we can actually then provide that DR into multiple data centers. So if you enact DR into one of our DCs, we can, if you require, provide straight away DR services to another DC. So we talked about recovery point objectives. This is a term we hear time and time again in both backup and DR. Recovery point objective is a function of how busy your business is. So if you've got a web server and you hardly ever change the content of that web server, on that individual server, a recovery point objective of 7 days might be enough. But if you've got a line of business SQL application, maybe it's a finance application that does nightly batch routing for you, and a recovery point objective of 24 hours. But if it's more integral to your business, you might want a recovery point objective as low as 10, 15 minutes, and that can be achieved with our service. You've also then got to consider, right, if I'm setting up a recovery point objective of nightly, how much data changes during the day? A gig. What's my window from midnight to 6 a.m.? So I need a bandwidth that can transfer a gig of data in 6 hours. Bearing in mind at the same time you might also be backing up, so take into consideration what else is going on. If you flip that on the head, however, it's actually quite weird to notice that if you then take that gig of data that changed during a 12 working hour day, it comes down to maybe less than 100 meg an hour, which means in each hour you need to replicate only 100 meg. Now, when we're trying to do a gig over 6 hours, we're trying to replicate more than 100 meg an hour. But if we actually break it down and decrease our recovery point objective to hourly, the WAN is actually smaller. And then also think about something called protection groups. So I sort of referred to this earlier on, this idea that a service isn't just one server. It might be a web server, an application server, and a DB server. And if I don't somehow make sure that they all meet the same defined recovery point objective, I can end up with an inconsistent environment when I fail over to DR. Think about your recovery time objectives. So as I say, your recovery point is once every 4 hours, but actually it isn't. Because let's be honest with you, if you're doing it once every 4 hours and it takes 30 minutes to replicate, then if you failed at 1 minute past 4 a.m., the 4 a.m. replication isn't going to be in DR yet. So your actual recovery point objective in that scenario would be 4 hours. Sorry, recovery point would be 4 hours 30 minutes, and your recovery time would be about the same. So you need to consider these differences and how these things work into the calculations. So I've sort of talked about it throughout the session so far, but let's give you a quick highlight introduction to NovaSco DR as a service. So NovaSco DR as a service is a managed service from us. It's designed to provide customers with vSphere, and indeed we can work with Hyper-V solutions at DR capability. Our actual DR platform is run on vSphere, but the tool sets that we use allow us to take VMs that are either running on vSphere or indeed Hyper-V and protect them. It combines a number of enterprise-grade technology platforms, so our service is built on what they call the V plus C plus E stack, so that's VMware as a hypervisor, it's Cisco Compute, and we're using EMC storage in there. But because the replication technology we use is VM level aware, we don't care what storage you're using. You might just be using direct attached storage, you might be using NetApp or Nimble or 3PAR or any other storage vendor. Because we replicate at the VM level, we can still do that for you. It's a self-service failover test or live. Yeah, so you can actually come into a portal and say, I want to failover. We're actually going to quiz you on that and say, are you sure? It gives you access to the recovered VM console via web interface. It recovers into a production-ready environment, as I say, built on V plus C plus E. It gives a high bandwidth, low latency connection that we integrate into our NovaSco managed WAN. In fact, all of our customers that are on DR as a service, we stipulate you need to have a WAN connectivity into our data center. It integrates with our hosted firewall, and this is a nice one. If you're actually a production MPLS WAN client with ourselves using the managed firewall, then when you fail over to DR, we don't have to change your IP addresses because you're coming in through our hosted firewall. We're still going to be using our same 3 internet breakout points, and we have the ability to present any of our public IP addresses in any of those 3 breakout points. Default parameters is we use a tool set. You may want to look at it. It's called Zerto to do this, and we by default allow a 24-hour continuous data protection history. So in fact, with our system, your recovery point objective is any time in the last 24 hours. Yeah. The worst being 15 minutes up to 24 hours. vSphere environments are based on what we call virtual protection groups. So we work with your business to understand how the servers interact with each other, put them into virtual protection groups, and we recover the protection groups. The protection groups can have a high, medium, or low replication. So a high one might be once every hour, medium might be once every 4 hours, low might be once every 24 hours. Fault logging, troubleshooting, statement of configuration, and testing capabilities all included. So why? Well, basically it's a predictable cost per VM per month, and that way you can feel back, you can go back to the business and say, we're paying X pound for these set of VMs. These set of VMs make up this service, so they are clear. That is all that is covered by DFAR. It gives you value for money with less waste because we're using a cloud platform where we have capacity that we can basically turn on by default on top. We can incorporate multiple clients onto that platform, and even if all of them fail over, we can still run it. But you don't have to go out and buy any hardware or software for this. It's just a price per VM per month. The only thing you have on top of that, as I mentioned earlier on, is the Microsoft licensing. It's a fully managed service, so we can put wrappers around it where we actually become your DR enactment team. So we will actually make sure that your staff can get in through remote access. We can test it any time, and we offer failover and failback. As I mentioned earlier on, what we actually do to use this is we use what we call tier 3 or higher data centers. So there's a table on there, and by the way, if anybody is interested, the slides can be sent out to you. We're also recording this webinar, so you can look at it again. And through NovaSchool, you can get in touch with me to ask any questions. But it's basically a tier 3 type data center, which means it's ISO 27001 certified. It's 24/7 secure audited access. It's got electrical feeds from separate substations with diverse A and B power feeds to each rack, and it's got a 2N or N+2 UPS configuration. So the whole idea is that you can take DR as a service, which most people see as a pain, and an insurance policy, and say, right, I've handed that off to someone else. It's their responsibility. They're going to tell me it works. They're going to be responsible for it working. They're going to give me service credits and KPIs around how it's going to work. That is in a tier 3 data center, uses a good MPLS transit and firewall solution, is based on an industry standard enterprise solution of V+C+E, and provides you with the ability to do test or live failovers and indeed live failbacks in the event that you need it. So I said I'd try and keep it to around about 30 minutes, unfortunately 35 minutes, but you know, we've got a few minutes for Q&A. Has anybody got any questions so far? Just trying to see, no questions. So as I say, if anybody wants to take, I'm going to send, well, my email address is mal.toner@novaschool.com. So thank you very much for your time, and hope you have an enjoyable rest of the day. Thank you, guys.